Wind, water, fire, and earth. Elements of creation. Elements of destruction. These are the forces of nature's fury. New Zealand, an island archipelago on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. Through the spine of the islands runs a fault line of earthquakes and volcanoes. This place is disaster central. Over the past decade, New Zealand has seen a barrage of deadly natural disasters. A savage earthquake fault that shook for 6 months of hell. Tornadoes that ripped through a city. And a volcano that unleashed its fury. This island at the edge of the world lives on the precipice of disaster, as meteorological expert Philip Duncan explains.
New Zealand's exposed to not just severe weather, but also seismic activity. We're on the ring of fire, so we share that with Japan and other parts around the Pacific that get lots of earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. So New Zealand is unique. You know, we have this position on Earth where we get a lot of things thrown at us.
Volcanologist Professor Heather Handley explains why these Pacific Isles are on such shaky ground.
There's been a lot of earthquake activity in New Zealand, and this is because these plates are either sliding or pushing or trying to push underneath each other. So the northern part of New Zealand sits on the Australian plate, and the southern part sits on the Pacific plate. So you can actually cross one of these tectonic plate boundaries in New Zealand. And because of this, there's so much tectonic activity and volcanic activity related to being close to one of these plate boundaries.
Christchurch, early 2011. The city is slowly recovering from 2 minor earthquakes that hit in 2010.
We certainly had the September quake earlier, and we had aftershocks, as you would expect in a large quake like that.
Helicopter pilot and rescue worker Mark Reed has worked on the front line of disasters across New Zealand.
We got off so light on the very first earthquake in September that no one would ever expect what happened in the February quake.
You know, the first 2 earthquakes, everything started on 4th of September 2010, and they caused massive liquefaction and damage here, but people were still living in this area.
Geologist Professor Misko Kubranoski understands the destructive force known as liquefaction, which had caused massive damage across Christchurch in late 2010, but without loss of life.
So during an earthquake, just imagine a strong shaking starts. Within 2, 3, 4 seconds, the soil is going to liquefy. And that means that the pore pressures in the ground, in the water, groundwater, are going to be extremely high. They pretty much result in separation of the soil particles, so the soil turns into viscous fluid, and that fluidized matter can then easily be ejected on the ground surface as ejector, soil ejector, and obviously there was a lot of water also reaching the ground surface.
Most New Zealanders have grown up with earthquakes, but most people don't spend every day worrying about it because they are sort of like, you can't control them. You don't know when they're going to happen.
It's been said that one of the great failings of Earth science is our inability to predict earthquakes.
Dr. Craig O'Neill is an earth and planetary scientist at Australia's Macquarie University.
Nearly every other natural disaster, we can come up with some sort of early warning system for. Tsunamis, we can see them coming across the ocean. Cyclones and hurricanes, we've got the satellite data these days. Even volcanoes, you can start to see them rise up as the magma rises. But earthquakes, you get zero warning for. They just occur, they release an enormous amount of energy in a fraction of a second, and then they're over with. And it's really, really difficult to predict where these things will occur.
These minor tremors that had occurred since the September 2010 earthquake masked a hidden hell. Christchurch was sitting on a fault line below the city centre.
But what we didn't know around Christchurch is there's lots and lots of little faults, and some of them have been identified, but lots haven't. And the fault that went on Christchurch was a previously unidentified fault that no one knew was there, but it built up strain across it over time, and when it went practically right underneath the city.
In Christchurch, for example, you have a magnitude 6.2 earthquake right underneath a populated city centre.
Earthquake scientist Mark Quigley sees the cause of these faults laying deep under the Earth's surface.
The Earth's crust is full of cracks. We call them fractures. They have a variety of different orientations. They extend down in continental crust to 10, 15, even 20 kilometers below the surface. As the Earth's crust is being squeezed by plate tectonic forces, all of those cracks are being put under stress. And eventually, the stress that's being applied to those cracks exceeds their frictional strength, and they break. And it's that breaking which creates an earthquake.
It's very difficult to map these fault systems, and so we can't actually see these things on the surface.
Tom Hawker and Penny Spencer were local residents of Christchurch and in a relationship together. They both enjoyed work at Christchurch's CTV building, a recently constructed TV studio and office block.
At the time of the earthquake, I was working for a company called CTV in Christchurch, and the day just started out just like any other normal day. Didn't really think much of it. And then that's when went out for lunch. I was with my girlfriend Penelope at the time.
On the day of the February earthquake, me and Tom went out for lunch late because I covered reception for Marianne while she was at lunch, so everything was normal.
Little did they know this shift in who covered reception would keep the young couple from harm's way when disaster struck. And Tom and Penny's friend, Marianne, was lulled into the feeling of a normal day, despite the two destructive earthquakes only a few months back in 2010.
Well, I had been on an early lunch break and I came back to work at 12:30. And I was, just doing the usual thing, and I was at reception, which was on the ground floor. Luckily, I was on the ground floor.
Professor Mark Quigley was also in Christchurch in 2011, studying the earlier earthquakes of 2010 that, while destructive, had not caused any deaths.
So there were no fatalities, and the effects were significant, but it was more the consequence of that earthquake changing the stress field of the entire crust around that region and triggering this prolonged and quite complicated aftershock sequence, which slowly migrated its way into the Christchurch region.
Little did Professor Mark Quigley realise his life's work was about to get life-threatening.
It was a tremendous time to be an earth scientist with expertise in earthquakes in that community, and people were very, very interested. And that all changed with the February earthquake, because all of a sudden everything became much more complicated, and there were the fatalities and the building collapses.
At the CTV building, it was a normal lunchtime break for young couple Tom and Penny and their colleague Marianne, when suddenly they felt what had now become common in Christchurch over the past few months, a rumbling in the ground.
The most thing that made me want to get out of the building was the noise, because that was horrific.
To everyone's horror, this rumbling was no minor aftershock. It was the most savage natural disaster to smash New Zealand in 50 years.
I personally didn't know the damage of every individual site at that stage, but you could tell there's a lot of carnage.
For the dozens of people caught in the CTV building, the situation was now life and death.
I was running for my life. And while I'm running, there's a lot of other earthquakes happening as well. And this church collapsed, a wall collapsed as well on one side. So there was a lot of noise happening.
After 2 previous earthquakes in the past few months, nature was now getting lethal, with a killer quake wrecking the city.
Bodies were retrieved from the CTV and laid down on tarps underneath to the side of us, and we could see there was a few fatalities at that stage.
And I remember Tom grabbed me. And hugged me really tight. And I think that was when it hit me what had actually happened. And that's when I just screamed.
I think the issue was that that earthquake created a prolonged aftershock sequence which migrated into Christchurch and in a sense took place on faults right beneath the city. Incredibly strong shaking. We're talking about in the Christchurch Central Business District. And so that ground shaking intensity exceeded the design capacity of the buildings. And in particular, the CTV building was the most dramatic of those.
Tom and Penny's colleague, Marianne, was inside the CTV building as the quake hit.
It sounded like a train or a plane landing on the roof of the building. Penelope and Tom heard the screams from the building, but I was running on the other side.
Quite a lot of stress and panic unfolded in a lot of these workplaces. I know I was about to head out for lunch with one of my mates, and we just stood in a doorway on opposite side of the hallway, staring at each other, going, "This is not good. This is a really strong earthquake."
So the ground motion that occurred was somewhere up to about 2G, so it was throwing people up into the air. One of the hardest hit points was actually a primary school in the area, which would have had kids flying up in the air like they were on a trampoline, really. Now, the problem with that sort of magnitude is if you're standing, you may well land on your feet, but a building won't. So that kind of acceleration on a building local to that area is really, really devastating. And it doesn't even matter if you build to earthquake standards, you're gonna cause some damage in the buildings regardless.
I ran straight up to the building, or what was left of it, and started like screaming people's names just in the hope that someone was able to hear me, I guess. I don't really know. It's just you do things in a panic. And
Marianne felt the spirit of her recently deceased mother had guided her out of the building.
I just think she was there with me and helped me get out.
the whole building had collapsed and she raced out.
The building came down, we reckon, in 12 to 15 seconds. So it was down. By the time I got to the middle of the road, it was down.
It was almost like a controlled demolition. That's what it looked like if you watch it, like a controlled demolition on TV.
As day turned to night, the race was on to rescue any survivors still trapped in the CTV building.
We're doing the CTV bucketing. There was quite a few bodies being recovered.
So we were obviously deployed down to the CTV site, and at that stage there was cordons being set up around the city and around the building sites, but people were still flowing in and out of those, so there was a huge amount of activity. But over time that dissipated as police started getting controls and cordons set up and removing people away from these rescue sites that didn't actually need to be there. So my role as an engineer, I work for engineering consulting business. So my day job has been designing buildings, and in particular in New Zealand, you design buildings to withstand the elements, in particular earthquakes. And my role is to use my structural knowledge, my knowledge of buildings, building construction, and ultimately how a building might collapse to work out how safe the environment is for carrying out rescues. When we landed in Christchurch, it was about 11 o'clock at night, and it was soon after midnight that I was part of the team, the heavy rescue team that was deployed to that site. And I suppose that's the other vivid memory for me of that day, is turning up to this building that was burning. So there was either car tyres, or there was a transformer, or there was something burning in the base of that building. And there'd been a lot of rescue effort already undertaken during the daylight hours, and we were, the site was handed over to us, and we were picking up from there. It was such a graphic picture with so many rescue personnel that were crawling all over the building, and that's the point that we really knew we were in for a very busy time over the next few days. But we were in shock. I've got a lot of friends that live in Christchurch, and there's one part shock and disbelief that this can happen on such a scale. I think particularly when we spend so much time and effort designing our modern buildings to withstand these types of earthquakes, to see the damage that can actually occur. But I think at the same time, I got very emotionally attached because I had skills that could be utilised, and there was a real sense of purpose for myself and for my colleagues, particularly engineers that were working in the recovery effort.
For earthquake expert Professor Mark Quigley, the danger of his vocation was becoming a reality.
The most challenging thing to deal with was that it broke all of the buried lifelines. So we had no water, no running water for weeks. We had no sewage for months. We had power outages. We had all sorts of really significant challenges to deal with as we were trying to stay in our home in a very badly affected area.
When the damage was done, huge swathes of Christchurch had now become a no man's land. Like the suburb of Darlington that was cleared of earthquake-damaged homes and turned into a park.
If you look down on these areas of eastern Christchurch now, you'll see that they are just empty lots. They've been grassed over. Nobody's living there. There are no services being provided.
We are in the former suburb of Darlington, which was heavily affected during the Canterbury earthquakes in 2010 and 2011. Here in this area along the Avon River, approximately 8,000 residential houses or properties were abandoned due to the heavy damage induced by liquefaction in the earthquakes.
A lot of people left very quickly after the earthquake. Other people left in short time. Over time, people stayed away, never come back.
Life was very difficult here. People still lived immediately after the earthquakes under quite difficult circumstances. And then the government decided that recovering this whole area would be extremely difficult, especially because of the high potential for reliquefaction. In total, the economic loss due to the earthquakes was approximately 40 billion New Zealand dollars. And rough calculations show that the effects of liquefaction was about 15 to 20 billion New Zealand dollars.
This is the remaining foundation of the elevator shaft, which is the only part of the building that was left standing after the earthquake.
I know that there was a tremendous amount of trauma that manifested its way into people's personal lives in a whole bunch of ways. Marriages breaking up and bad things happening.
For Penny and Tom, the quake marked a line in their relationship.
Me and Tom left Christchurch about a year after the earthquake. Basically because we just had enough. I think the earthquake did put a strain on me and Tom's relationship. I mean, everybody deals with things differently.
I think going through an event, what we went through together, it both sort of bound us together, almost like Siamese twins, effectively. But then at the same time too, I think we were both dealing with our own issues from it, and stuff that we were incapable of dealing with together, like post-traumatic stress, depression and all those sort of things. So it kind of got to the point where we just weren't gelling anymore and things weren't working. And then, you know, we stayed together for 4.5 years, but then after that it just didn't work. But at the end of the day, she's always a person that's going to be there for me at the end of the day, and I'm always be there for her. And in a weird sort of a way, I think going through something like we have has brought us closer together, and you can't break that bond.
There has been much controversy as to why many of the Christchurch buildings collapsed so quickly.
185 people died in the Christchurch earthquake. The vast majority of them, about 115, were in one building, the Canterbury Television building, which collapsed. And it turned out that its construction was faulty, probably shouldn't have been approved. So that was a real human tragedy.
It's not the earthquakes which kill people, it's the buildings that are substandard or not designed to withstand earthquakes that usually kill people.
Christchurch still remembers those who died in the CTV building collapse.
That was where the building was. The entrance was just past that tree there. It's right, it's all gone, and they've made it into lovely gardens. Yeah, there's a memorial there. These stones have all the names on of all my friends and colleagues that lost their lives in the building. The names are wearing off with all the weather here. This is Joe Giles's stone. Her daughter was the one that ran to me and asked me, had I seen her mother? And I knew that she was in the building, which was very upsetting, very upsetting. I couldn't tell her.
So there were in total 185 fatalities caused by the 22nd February earthquake 2011. Majority of those were in the two buildings that collapsed. So there was widespread damage throughout the city. The central business district was affected heavily. 80% of the high-rise buildings in the CBD were demolished because of the heavy damage. And immediately after the earthquakes, the whole area was cordoned off, so there was no public access to the center of the city where most of the commercial and cultural activities were actually happening. That was a huge impact.
Years after the sequence had kind of died down, I was scared to go near unreinforced masonry buildings. When a train or a tram would come by, I would get a pulse in my heart that would sort of make me feel anxious or make me want to respond. And I think that is something that is being increasingly recognized in the psychological literature around how this disaster has affected people.
Got it, mate?
Yeah, I got it.
Right from a fence, I must say.
Oh, thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
Not the most gracious of exits.
Very kind.
While the spine of New Zealand's islands rests on one of the most active tectonic fault lines on the planet, the nation's most populous city, Auckland, is also prey to extreme weather like tornadoes.
There's a part of Auckland that I call Tornado Alley. It's our own version of it. So these storms can come offshore, sit over this area and grow, and then as they grow, they move out over land. The land is warm from daytime heating, and that pushes up into the clouds and makes the clouds go even higher in the sky. And when that happens, you've got different currents, and it starts to spin. So you can end up with a tornado.
Inspector Shannon Gray is a police officer in Auckland, and he was on the front line the day a twister smashed through the town.
There was no prior warning of this weather event, and even if we look out the window today, it's slightly overcast, a few dark clouds, and probably not too dissimilar to the 3rd of May when this event occurred. And it very much just did come out of nowhere. I was actually on my way back from a meeting further down the motorway when I heard the incident come through, and the tornado landed pretty much bang smack in the Albany Mall area where we're driving around at the moment.
A lot of the big thunderstorms that we get in New Zealand bubble up at the very end of the day with very little warning in the morning, and that was a classic example of that. Now, we knew something was building around that time. I think we put out a specific warning saying between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m, and from memory it arrived at 2:55. So we knew there was a window where something might happen.
Sophie Bond was studying to be a nurse when the tornado hit.
That day I was nannying a baby, who I did that part-time. And we got into the car, and then I noticed a disturbance sort of out of the corner of my eye near the pack and save. And I was a bit confused, and then I sort of saw sheets of building material flying through the air. And I was just wondering what is going on. So the tornado moved up here, and then when it got to this roundabout, I saw a car fly through the air, which was insane. Because up until that point, I hadn't been sure quite what the storm was. But then seeing the car flip, you realise it's a tornado. Oh no, I'd never experienced a tornado before. My only knowledge of a tornado was maybe in Wizard of Oz, where you see that classic twister. And so I was so confused when I saw the sheets of metal flying off the building.
When I first arrived at the scene, there was quite a lot of confusion, and I immediately took over as the incident controller on the ground. And really my first priority was to understand the number of fatalities.
I got out of the car around here, and then there was just a scene of chaos here. So lots of injured people laying on the ground, and then huddles of people over them trying to help. It was just really quite overwhelming because there were so many people injured or just so many people hurrying around. You weren't quite sure where to go first or who needed the most help. So I sort of saw one person that looked like they were the most injured, and so that's where I went first.
Survival expert and one of the world's top stunt women, Kai Fano, has some clear advice when caught in a tornado.
During a tornado or hurricane, the best thing you can do is stay indoors, get into the smallest room or closet you can, get down low, stay away from all windows and glass doors, and ride out the storm. Thing to remember with tornadoes and hurricanes is there is a thing called the eye of the storm. So during the storm, there'll be a moment that it will be incredibly calm and you'll think it's over, but wait and listen to your local news until authorities have deemed it safe.
So the power of the event, and obviously any other significant weather event like these, I think people don't have an understanding of it. It's literally has the ability to pick up vehicles, roofs of houses, other even, quite firmly secured objects, and really just toss them hundreds of feet in the air or hundreds of feet across the ground.
There were people running everywhere, people huddled over, lifeless forms on the ground. And so I was sort of, wondering, who should I go to first? And I saw this guy who looked to be in quite a bad way, because there was a guy on the phone doing heart compressions. And I went over, and the guy was on the phone talking to the ambulance, just sort of, the emotion in his voice was, really intense, sort of saying, like, get here now. And so that's when I gave the guy mouth-to-mouth, because the guy doing CPR was one-handed because he was on the phone, so I thought I'd try mouth-to-mouth, but very quickly realised that the man had passed away. It was quite a surreal feeling, because I had seen that car go through the air. I knew there were other people that were injured, and so I knew I couldn't, just sit back and feel anything, because I knew that I had to go and help other people. So I just had to completely switch off my feelings in that regard.
Sophie was unable to save Benedict de Caen, a family man with 2 children.
Every time I'm here, I think about it. You can't not really. It's such a huge event, and it's because you were so involved and so emotionally involved, and you sort of got quite emotionally invested. It really does, sear in your memory.
Tragically, this was not the only tornado to thrash New Zealand.
Just over a year later, following the Albany tornadoes, a more destructive and significant tornado hit the Whenuapai and Hobsonville area. The date of that was the 6th of December 2012. In that event, we had 3 fatalities, and we had another 7 people injured as a result of that weather event. Having been involved in both of these significant weather events, I certainly have a very new perspective and understanding of the sheer magnitude of these types of events, and have a whole new respect for what Mother Nature can throw at us. And it makes you feel very small and vulnerable as a human being on this earth, when you know the size and magnitude of these types of weather events and the destruction that it can cause.
Tornadoes and earthquakes aren't the only forces that threaten New Zealand. The nation is riddled with active volcanoes.
So a volcano is really the surface expression of the Earth letting off heat. So underneath the Earth, in different places, the Earth is molten. So it's magma or molten rock. And this rock is lighter than the surrounding area, so it rises towards the surface. And where it reaches the surface and comes out on the land, that's where a volcano occurs.
One of the most famous volcanoes in the country is White Island Volcano, off the coast of New Zealand's North Island.
White Island is one of New Zealand's most active volcanoes. It has had historical eruptions. It is a tourist destination. People go out there most days and do a tourist walk around the volcano. And they can see evidence for active volcanic activity when they're there.
Tourists like father and daughter Jeff and Leilani from nearby Hamilton in New Zealand's North Island.
Monday, 9th of December 2019, we had planned a trip to White Island with Leilani, the 2 of us. We'd been planning this for 6 months. She'd actually bought it for my 50th birthday back in June.
Leilani studied geology, so she was excited when she got the chance in late 2019 to visit the island.
Being a geography and geology student, I was so excited to go. Going to an active volcano was something I'd always wanted to do, so I was, ecstatic and over the moon to be able to go.
It's a common journey for tourists, with huge cruise liners making the stop-off a favourite destination for their passengers' day trips.
I've been to White Island. I visited there as a tourist in the late 1990s, possibly with a higher risk threshold than I currently have, but it was not a weird thing to do. It was not something that was viewed to be incredibly risky relative to other things one might do in New Zealand.
So I think going that close to an active volcano and being that close to active lava lakes obviously carries some risk with it. And I think you have to have a very strong nerve to go that close, because situations can change at any time. So even in a situation where people think a volcano behaves in a particular way and kind of keeps going that way, there can be very sudden changes in activity. So there's always going to be a risk if you go that close to a volcano that you may lose your life.
Jeff and Leilani arrived ready for what they thought would be an exciting day. But even during their check-in, there were dark omens.
Yeah, so we arrive, head to the offices, the White Island tour offices. We signed ourselves in with a next of kin, contact details.
As they waited for the boat to take them to the active volcano, little did they know the worst-case scenario of adventure tourism was about to become a horrific reality.
The White Island eruption occurred on the 9th of December, about 2:11 p.m. There were more than 40 tourists on the island at the time. It was almost certainly related to an influx of water getting into a highly pressurized part of the volcano, which then created a rapid buildup in pressure, which then was released via this eruption.
I think it's just the unexpectedness of volcanoes and earthquakes which has drawn me to them.
Visiting the volcanic island with Leilani and her father were boatloads of international tourists, few of them aware of the looming disaster.
To go that close to active volcanoes and that close to activity in lava lakes boiling away and bubbling, there's always going to be a really large risk that something could happen. Because some of these volcanoes, they don't behave exactly how you want them to be, and they don't behave how they've behaved for all the time in the past. They can suddenly change their behavior. So there's always a risk going that close to volcanic activity.
That morning, one of the pilots had passed over and noticed that the crater lake was white and not the usual greeny blue. And the tour guide was very keen to see this. They talked about some kind of ash event overnight. So there definitely had been some activity, but nothing that showed any concern.
Once on the island, Jeff and Leilani experienced a truly off-world landscape.
As I went around the island, yes, 100%. There were gigantic sulfur crystals, fumaroles. It was everything I ever could have wished for. The crater lake was breathtaking. At no point did I think there was any danger.
Crater lake can see down into it. It's not boiling. It's hot, but not boiling. I think we were told 40, 50 degrees, but highly acidic. And I remember the tour guide said it 100 times stronger than battery acid. So I guess on a level of acidicness, something that would burn you, definitely.
To experience the raw nature of the Earth up close was a truly sublime experience for Jeff and daughter Leilani. They returned safely to the boat and were headed back to the mainland when the volcano erupted.
I grabbed my phone and I ran to the back of the boat. I bolted past everybody.
I could see this plume of black and grey and white ash and steam just towering above the island and just straight up hundreds of feet into the air. At that stage, it had changed from anything beautiful to very sinister, quite menacing. And we knew that there were people still on the island. And I think there was a realization at that stage that people still on the island were now engulfed in that ash.
When it occurs, if there are people exposed to the volcano at that time, they're highly vulnerable. For example, they could be engulfed in very, very hot eruptive products like dust and ash, which can cause tremendous burning to them and cause them to lose their lives.
There was a realization throughout the boat that there were people still on the island.
The tour boat raced back to the island to rescue any survivors. As they approached, the horror of the disaster was evident.
The people that were in the water, there was one person that was clearly swimming out to the moored boat, and there's got to be something that makes you want to swim 150 metres out into a moored boat. You're running from or swimming from something to get away. Our crew had launched the inflatable and we could see they were picking up the people that were in the water.
I've never seen the burns as bad as what they have. People's skin looked like it was just falling off. I've seen burns before and blisters, but nothing like this. It covered their whole bodies. Some people's eyes were blocked with ash and they couldn't see. They were in extreme pain. People had burns under their clothes.
With a boatload of seriously injured survivors, they raced back to the mainland.
So on the way back, just after halfway, we ran out of fresh water. And at that point, there was nothing else I could really do for people except for comfort them. And it was a mix of noises in the back of the whirring of the boat and people screaming. So I sat down with a few of the more critical patients that I had at the back, and I just started humming a song more for my own, I guess, peace of mind. And then one of the guys that I sat with grabbed my ankle when I stopped humming, and he said to keep going. So then I started quietly singing a song just to them to give them, I guess, a sense of hope and joy, better than sounds of people screaming in pain.
The tourist boat made its mercy dash to shore where emergency services were waiting. Jeff and Leilani were safe, but deeply shocked.
The reason that we were where we were on that day was so we could help others. We've talked about if we'd have still been on the island when it erupted, there would have been double the casualties and nobody to help. And that would have been a very different scenario.
So I don't think there's really any way we can stop a volcano eruption from occurring. So sometimes people have tried to divert the hazards or the risks from those volcanoes, but we can't actually stop a volcanic eruption from occurring. And to be honest, in historic time, we've not witnessed some of these really large volcanic eruptions, and the impact that they could have on today's society, we don't know, because we've not witnessed one of these eruptions in history.
While Jeff and Leilani were able to help many of the survivors, 20 people lost their lives in the White Island volcano disaster.
Sleep is the one thing that I've found difficult. When you sleep, you have no control over, I guess, where your thoughts go.
we've been able to connect with some of the families of some of the survivors, so that's some that are in local hospitals to us. Being able to connect with them has been really good therapy.
I don't think that I would have done anything different than anyone else put in that situation. For me, I didn't do anything heroic. I was just a person who was at that place and helped the best I could. I didn't put myself in any danger to help anyone. I just did anything I could to help.
Some scientists are looking at climate change being connected to seismic activity.
Yeah, in places where you have climate warming and glacial melting, the change in the stress state of the crust around the glaciers is changing because, in a sense, the glaciers are melting and there's a reduction of mass, and so the crust is kind of rebounding a little bit, popping off in smaller earthquakes. So yeah, glacial melting can trigger earthquakes.
I think the last decade has proven that we're living in a part of the world that is somewhat vulnerable to significant weather events. If we look at what has happened in the last 10 years, particularly the tornadoes that have occurred in Albany and Hobsonville, the earthquakes in Christchurch, of course the most recent event, which has been our eruption at White Island in the Bay of Plenty, makes it so very important for emergency services to continue to be prepared for these types of events and how we respond.
No matter where you are in the world, there are always going to be the risk of something happening. You never know what is going to happen. You could be a normal day and then everything changes. So you can try and prepare yourself as much as possible, but the reality is you really never know what's going to happen.
The effects are encoded deep within us in ways that we can't always even make sense of or ration our way out of, even as a very rational person, like a scientist. It affects us just the same as it does people who don't know anything about science. It has a real deep and long-lasting emotional effect.